It's almost time to say
good night
to the ground effect regulations that were introduced in 2022. Those fancy Venturi tunnels that made the cars stick like Velcro on the track are getting a complete overhaul for the 2026 regs, and this will be a game changer for F1 teams and drivers in general. It's getting toned down seriously, but why does it matter and how will it actually affect the drivers and teams? I want to give a big thank you for all the support on the channel. You guys mean the world. If you're new here, please go ahead and subscribe. Make sure you check out the Unchained Media Inc. website. The Unchained Race Week predictions are up now and live for Belgium. Make sure you go ahead and drop yours. And the clothing will soon be out. Wait for that on the website, so make sure you're subscribed as well. Custom made, but let's go over the big overhaul and how it will affect these teams for 2026. Now, starting with the basics as to what the ground effects really were for this regulation period we're still kind of currently in. The ground effect in F1 was the secret sauce that made these cars corner like they were on rails. Back in 2022, F1 reintroduced ground effect with those curvy Venturi tunnels that create a low pressure zone that sucks the car to the track, generating massive downforce without relying too much on the front and rear wings. And the whole idea behind it was to take out the dirty air that was such a problem in the previous regulation of cars. And that sounded all great as we made it into 22, but then the problems started arising. As while we did have better racing, a lot of teams were struggling with a big porpoising problem. Most of the cars on the grid were going up and down, flopping like a fish out of water. And the cars themselves were too low and very stiff. A driver like Lewis Hamilton got out of the car a couple of times and looked like his back went through hell just through one race session. Also in wet races, not to mention the spray that it kicks up. We just recently saw this in Silverstone. The drivers cannot see. Isaac Hadjar just went into the back of Kimi Antonelli. And can you even really blame the guy looking at the onboard? There is really not anything a driver can do in those situations because of the amount of spray getting kicked up, with that diffuser being so wide in these floor regulation cars. And the FIA has tried toning this down. They heard the complaints from the drivers, and there is now this big overhaul. So for this new regulation period, no more Venturi tunnels. We are going to have flat-like floors very similar to that of 2021 with a much less powerful diffuser, which will cut the downforce by about 15%, which was way less than what was previously talked about. At some point, these regs were looking like 40% cut of downforce, which would have meant about like a 5 or 6 second difference to what we have right now. So first of all, talking about performance, really going from these 22 to 26 regs, what effect it will have on the cars. Well, if you look at ground effect cars back in 1982, and Keke Rosberg had a pole lap at Brands Hatch, which I think might be one of my least favorite tracks to drive on the simulator, but a very cool looking track. I wish I was better at it. The lap time there was a 1:09.5 with ground effect, and as they made the ban in 1983, lap times dropped about 2.5 seconds. So for 2026, the FIA actually expects to be about 2 seconds slower per lap than the 2022 to 2025 beasts. Now, for most of us, 2 seconds might not sound like a lot, but it's a pretty drastic change for Formula One itself. These cars still will look fast, but we will see a very noticeable change in the timing if you keep up with the lap times from track to track. And some tracks might see an even bigger drastic drop, like Monza, for example. The actual reduction in really the floor generating more downforce means that teams can't rely just on the floor for grip. They're going to have to lean a lot more into these wings and the active aerodynamics, switching between that Z mode and X mode for obviously low drag on the straights and higher downforce in the corners. Even in the thumbnail, I used an image made and rendered by Q''vis Designs. Make some beautiful stuff. Go ahead and give them a follow on Twitter or X, whatever you end up calling it. But this perfectly shows you the difference between the 2026 floor and what the 2022 floors looked like. Now let's talk about the drivers and who it can impact. As I stated, the ground effect itself forced drivers and teams to run super low, super stiff setups, which was like a skateboard over cobblestone for most drivers on most weekends. Plenty of drivers complained about the back pain. You ended up having Alonso say he didn't really care as long as he had the fastest car, which I think is very Alonso-like. But not only with performance, these cars should be much easier to drive and easier on the backs of really our older and younger drivers. with much softer suspensions, and the ride quality should improve drastically. We might actually have some drivers come out of their cars and smile rather than frown in pain. Now, this will affect the cars in high speed because those Venturi tunnels generated so much of that stick to the ground and allowed for a lot of confidence for these drivers to just pull it flat in many of corners that weren't flat before. Curb usage will be much more significant in the 2026 regs in comparison to what we've had now, as the cars won't be as low in ride height, and that will also change the way that drivers are taking racing lines, and with that as well, every driver on the grid is going to have to adapt their driving style. And now, yes, we have seen most of these drivers in the previous regs, I'm talking before 2022, but with the active aerodynamics, it's going to be a bit different, and these cars will feel a lot less grippy to what they've been used to. A driver in particular I want to put on high notice should have a much different season to 25 will be Lewis Hamilton. His driving style with that heavy braking, leaning a lot on the car having a decent rear end did not work with the current regulations we're in right now. The new 2026 stuff will be a lot harder to adapt to, and I think the more experienced the driver is, your Fernando Alonso, Lewis Hamilton, think even Nico Hülkenberg, Carlos Sainz, the more older drivers on the grid, we'll have a much better time with this. The guys that like a bit of understeer, it should actually work for this car much better than the previous cars where understeer just always seems like a problem because of how boat and heavy like they are. But the adaptable drivers like Leclerc and Verstappen will still do very good even though they drive with a lot of slide and oversteer. More Leclerc, Verstappen is more smooth and loves a very strong front end, so still oversteer but controls the car a lot better. The sliding really comes from Leclerc's style. Now for the teams, engineers working on these cars, it's going to be a whole new ballgame. The actual ground effect floors made it super complex, expensive, and very sensitive to even the slightest of changes. Setup mattered even more than upgrades in this regulation because if the car wasn't balanced right, it didn't really matter what you put on it if it gave more downforce, but that resulted in the car being very jumpy and weird in the high speed with no confidence. It didn't matter. The setup was the most important part in this regulation period, and that usually meant that both drivers couldn't go for different setups like we saw previously, but in this regulation period, your perfect example is a guy like Perez, who was driving with Verstappen, had to try and adapt to what Max liked, and instead of having that understeer that he liked. Same with Carlos and Charles, both had to adapt to a certain specific car. As I stated, a bad upgrade could literally turn a podium contender into a back marker if it wasn't done correctly. We've seen that on Ferrari multiple times. They are the kings of giving us high expectations and then it just failing. I mean, Aston Martin did a great job of bringing a bunch of downgrades as well. This setup window should be much more open for these 2026 cars. And as I stated, I think understeer will still work a little bit better than we've seen it previously, as these cars will be smaller, lighter, so you should be able to turn them much better. And Pirelli is shrinking the tire width as well, which should give us a more agile looking car on the field. There is a possibility of fewer pit stops, which I actually think was the case as well before in the previous regulation period. It was the dirty air that was causing a lot of these teams to really go through tires, but hopefully a lot less dirty air. I would like less pit stops if it meant better racing, but the teams could follow more closely, which is the aim with these regulations. So all in all, this change on the underfloor not being the biggest provider of downforce on these F1 cars will result in a real game changer for some of the guys that struggled in this regulation period. Lewis Hamilton is the greatest example of this, going from 2021 where he was pretty much about to win the championship to now losing out to some teammates. He had a decent 2023 season. That will be the real test for him to see whether he's lost it or not, but also a real test on a guy like Fernando. Can he adapt quickly like he usually does? And it'll be nice to see different driving styles again because it felt a lot like the same in 25. It's got to be smooth. You got to be very effective on how you turn that car, especially in the race. Everybody drives pretty much the same. But now there should be a much bigger learning curve, which I'm looking forward to. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it in the comments below. Also wanted to give a big thank you to everybody that's recently became a member and everybody else that's obviously stayed from before. Big thank you to you all. But if you guys did enjoy the video, please leave a like, subscribe. It would mean the world. And peace.